Hi, we enter into the final section of the Solomon narrative today, chapters 8, 9, and 10, and after that we'll get to the transition in chapter 11 to the succession to Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the end of the united monarchy, short-lived with David and Solomon. As you can see on the right side of the screen, I've been following this outline of Solomon's reign, and now we're going to look at these chapters here, 8, 9, and 10. And they're very complex in ways that I've alluded to earlier, but now we really need to focus on it. And we'll look at that in a moment when we just look at the questions to consider. But briefly, let's just consider what's in these chapters. Chapter 8 is Solomon assembling all these various people, and we'll look at that in a moment, of who he assembles, for a prayer blessing of the temple. And one of the great ironies here is the story is almost certainly, at least in part, from the time of exile. So just at the moment that Judah and Jerusalem are reaching their peak, where there's peace and there's King Solomon and the temple has been established and everything is right, the story is actually talking about when everything has failed and the time of exile, as we'll see, at least in part. And then in chapter 9 and 10, we have a series of various things. There's a second vision of Yahweh to Solomon, matching the dream that we heard in chapter 3 there. And we're told it happened in the same way, although it doesn't say a dream. So we'll hear that there. And then there's a back and forth between Solomon and Hiram of Tyre, who we saw in these chapters of 5 and 6 around the question of financing the temple and providing timber and laborers. And yet there's something not being said, as we'll see here, and some kind of conflict there, and we'll look at that. And then there's questions of forced labor and some other elements. But then in chapter 10, the famous Queen of Sheba appears. And it's a short passage, but that didn't stop it from becoming a full-length film with Gina Lollobrigida and Yul Brynner as the titular characters. I suppose at the time Sword and Sandals films are really popular. There's another one, of course, of David and Bathsheba as well. So whether it's Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, or Bathsheba, either way, they make it into Hollywood film with much hyperbole, of course. Then there's a summary of Solomon's gold and other riches. And one of the questions we'll really be looking at, is this all meant to praise Solomon or to criticize him? And we'll have to see what criteria that might be under. We'll look at that in just a minute. And then there's chapter 11, which is plainly a harsh critique. And we'll look at that in relation to what follows and the succession, as I noted. So let's go back at some of these questions to consider. And I raised these at the beginning of chapter 3, but they really come up now, and we'll see why. And I won't go over them in detail, but it's important that we have these in mind as we enter. So we don't need to look at question 1 because we already looked at that in the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings. But we really need to focus here on when the story was written. And these options are all still available at the time of the succession, at the time of King Hezekiah, after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to Assyria, at the time of King Josiah, and a question of Josiah's so-called reform, or during exile, or some combination of the above. And I can just say right now, it's probably some combination. But scholars have been grappling with this question now for perhaps 200 years and really have no consensus, and new books and articles come out all the time. So any sense that scholars might think they have solved the problem is almost always challenged by other scholars who say, but not quite. So we'll have to look at some of that, but we won't go down the rabbit hole because it's very deep. Question 3 is related. Can we discern one section from another in terms of time of composition? And mostly we'll just look at that as we go. Number 4, how are we to see Solomon's empire of Israel and Judah in relation to other powerful nations? We saw in chapter 3 that Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter, and she will appear again in our immediate section here. Similarly, King Hiram of Tyre and the question of that relationship. In both of these, are they allies, colonial overseers, or competitors? And what about the indigenous Canaanites of the various quote-unquote nations that we'll see here? And certainly from a Deuteronomistic perspective, those are seen as to be destroyed, and yet we know from the book of Joshua, probably written at the time of Josiah, that the people were still there. And they're obviously still there in the presence of many of the wives that we'll hear about Solomon having married in chapter 11. So given all that, is the story pro-Solomon, anti-Solomon, or some combination? And what criteria should be used? And we need to look at a whole series of these because even today, even some large commentaries from scholarly commentators take it at face value. Take it as what we hear as Yahweh's authentic view of Solomon and that Solomon is being sincere here. So some still take it simply on its face, whether it's historical or otherwise, that this is telling us something about Solomon's relationship with Yahweh and Yahweh's relationship with the Israelites and the Judahites. But most scholars would see it otherwise. For example, we can compare Solomon's reign to other kings in 1st and 2nd Kings, such as Josiah, who is described there as no king before or after was as great as Josiah. And in using that and considering that, we might compare Deuteronomy 17 under the criteria of which Solomon's reign is purely evil. And that certainly suggests that Deuteronomy came later. You wouldn't likely portray Solomon as doing everything exactly contrary to Torah without actually mentioning Deuteronomy 17 in 1 Kings, which is not mentioned. So as we'll see, Deuteronomy 17 is almost certainly a reflection later, but later than what is one of the questions we'll have to look at, and it can get very confusing. Using Exodus, which, as I've argued in earlier chapters, is the counter story to the succession story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, written right after this, at least in its original form. And so we'll be looking at some of the comparisons of the Mishkan, the wilderness tabernacle, and the Jerusalem temple, which we've already looked at some, but we'll be seeing more of that as we go. How about Genesis 2 and 3? The story of Garden of Eden, of course, almost certainly from the exilic period, and some folks have written it as inherently a story anti-monarchy, and we won't look at that now. But that's certainly one of the questions, especially around the question of the knowledge of the wisdom of good and evil, or the knowledge of good and evil, understood as the wisdom that Solomon asked for in chapter 3 of 1 Kings. And then finally, from my own criteria, the religion of empire versus religion of creation, evaluate monarchy from the perspective of Jesus, at least, who sides with the religion of creation. So in the end, what is Solomon's wisdom? And we'll see how tightly it's connected with wealth here. It's really the original prosperity gospel, if it's meant to be praise and not criticism, which is one of the things we'll have to look at. Then we have to consider what's not narrated. Throughout the David story, it was all about war and military battles. The saying that pissed off Saul so much was that the women in the streets singing, "Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands," like it was a battle for who could be the greater murderer. And of course, it was Saul who sent David off to fetch 100 Philistine foreskins as a wedding present. So certainly war and military and battles and killing were central before, but we don't see anything about that in Solomon other than his executing the people that his father David told him to do on his deathbed, and as well as his brother Adonijah. What about, speaking of his family, what about his relationship with his family? We hear nothing about his remaining brothers, and in the David story, his sons and one daughter were throughout the story, but we hear nothing about Solomon's relationship after the kingship is established in his hands at the end of chapter 2. What about his other wives? We've not heard anything about any of them except Pharaoh's daughter, and yet in chapter 11, we're going to find out that between women and concubines, he has the round number of 1,000. Similarly with children, we're going to hear of only one son, Rehoboam. Is it possible with all these women and no war to distract him from it, he only fathered one son? That certainly seems unlikely, but we don't hear about any others. And finally, what he looks like or how old he is. I skipped the question of the wealth to pay for Solomon's enormous expenses, because really we find out in these chapters it comes from the gold provided by the Queen of Sheba and from Hiram and others, as well as the tribute that we saw set up for extraction in chapter 4. So that one we've really answered. So what to do with all those questions? Well, first, let's look at this briefly, this timeline of the monarchy and the composition here. So just want to do this as an overview, a part of our introduction to this, but here's in a timeline the references I was making here and the questions to consider of the question of when it was written. So here's the time of the narrative. The Assyrian conquest is here, and that's roughly the time of King Hezekiah in Judah, who fights off the Assyrians by paying them tribute. The time of Josiah and the presence of at least an early version of Deuteronomy, especially Deuteronomy 17, which, as I was noting, trashes the reign of Solomon, but seems to want to establish some kind of renewed united kingdom between Israel and Judah in Jerusalem. We'll get to that more when we get to 2 Kings 22 and 23, but for now it's important to see how that could have had an influence on the section we're reading in 1 Kings 8 and 9. Then the final version, certainly the second book of Kings could not have been written before the events narrated were completed, but it could have been written sometime later. It's hard to say exactly. We probably won't go through all of it in Radical Bible here, but there certainly is some final version, whether immediately after the events narrated in the Exile or sometime thereafter. But in the same time period as Ezekiel, Leviticus, and Genesis, at least some form of each of those, and we'll look at that again in just a moment. Then, after the Babylonian conquest, half a century later, the Persians conquest of Babylon, and Genesis, as people like Mark Brett and others have noted, is certainly revised in light of the Persian situation. And then finally, the Septuagint, the Greek version, created in Alexandria, fittingly, the Greek city named after Alexander the Great, as his successors, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, established reign in that area. And there's further reasons for perhaps going back to the question of monarchy. So we'll be looking at that as we go. And one of the questions we need to look at, especially from the perspective of exile, because First Kings 8 talks about the very presence of exile. Obviously, it's a future event, but the fact that they know about it suggests to most scholars that they know about it because it's happened. And so we can see it as one of a series of responses to the exile. And I really want to highlight that the exile is a much bigger dispute and division among people than any of us can really imagine. It's a conquest that destroys the capital city and takes the elite into exile hundreds of miles away and leaves really open the question of whether there will be any kind of restoration. And we can think of all the different peoples from the ancient world, including Babylonians themselves, but also Hittites and Edomites and Moabites and all those people who were conquered and eventually disappeared from history. Bet you don't know too many Moabites these days, or people who claim any kind of Moabite ancestry, or Hittite, or so many of the others that we hear named in the Bible, but no longer exist. So it was a real question of whether Judahites or Israelites would continue to exist after this, or simply be a distant memory. And these texts are a series of ways of trying to establish some kind of vision for a restoration. So 2 Chronicles, as like the first book of Chronicles, follows the books of Kings, but leaves out all the sexy and controversial parts and really focuses on the temple. We'll look at a moment how closely it follows 1 King. Ezekiel provides a vision for a new temple, Ezekiel explicitly writing from the 25th year of exile, as he announces right at the beginning, and has a 9-chapter vision. But in his vision of the restored house, the focus is not on kings, the focus is on priests, and which ones will be allowed to come close. And although no king is mentioned, including David, it does focus on rite rituals with priests as the leaders, and no foreigners are allowed to come close. So it shares with Ezra and Nehemiah the sense that foreignness is going to be expelled from this revised polity if it comes to be. Ezra and Nehemiah writing when it does come to be under Persian rule. And there they present the rebuilding of the House of YHWH is initiated and financed by the Persian king from local tribute from the province that the Persians know as Yehud, the former Judah and surrounding region. But this is where it's most explicitly made subject to the fact that the men who will be allowed to be part of this restored polity around the new temple must get rid of their foreign wives and the children of their foreign wives. And they're described as sending away, but where would you send them away to? It's really sending them away to their death. So Ezra and Nehemiah calls for the death of foreigners in order to be part of a restored new temple community. Leviticus goes a very different direction, and although it narrates a process that's built on the Exodus Mishkan, it's certainly a literary expression of that, not naming that as a physical expression. It focuses on the Mount Sinai traditions and the emphasis on social justice, the very text of love of neighbor that Jesus calls upon as the other great commandment, the first one being from Deuteronomy, to love God with all your being, comes from Leviticus, as well as the practice of Jubilee, which is central to Jesus' mission statement in Luke's Gospel in chapter 4, which he calls fulfilled, although he relies on the Isaiah 61 version of it, not the Leviticus version, but the idea is the same. So in Leviticus, the restored community would have no temple or king, but would have a community built around right practices and social justice. Genesis goes the furthest, the most radical, narrates a time of beginning when everybody is made in the image and likeness of God. So in that sense, there are no foreigners, but there are, because there are urban empires. And so it isn't so much as we'll see their foreignness, but their imperial structure that becomes the struggle for opposition. When there's no food, for example, and Abraham convinces Sarah to lie to Pharaoh to protect him in the face of the apparent monopoly on food in Egypt. And I continue this in the Gospels and Paul because these are post-exilic texts too. And if they weren't in a separate collection, there's the New Testament, we'd see them as they are as further post-exilic compositions, raising the question in the face of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem for what a renewed polity will be. And there, in the Gospels and Paul, it's clear that no new temple is envisioned. Rather, the individual person is a temple of God, or the community as the body of Christ, the body of the Messiah. And then finally, in the last book of the Bible, book of Revelation, God is said to dwell in a tent on the streets of the holy city like a homeless person does, right there on the downtown streets, and there's explicitly no temple. So a wide range of possibilities from a new temple, as envisioned in Ezekiel and Ezra and Nehemiah, to something other than a temple, whether that's an image of the Mishkan in Leviticus or simply people being on the earth and not needing a temple because God is present everywhere. So our story in 1 Kings 8 is certainly in conversation with some or all of those texts. Let's look just briefly at the three that I was just naming that are the most historically connected to the story of Solomon. 1 Kings 8, as we see here, 2 Chronicles 5 to 7 there, and Ezra 6 here. The parts that are in bold are the parts that are in common here between 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. The parts that are in blue here are the parts that are added in 2 Chronicles, and the parts that are in green here are the parts that are omitted by 2 Chronicles. And if I just scroll through it, you can see it's almost identical, but there's several things in blue that are added, and that's primarily around priests and the role of priests. You can see that there and here, a bronze platform, which isn't specifically about priests, but echoes some of the priestly concerns. Whereas in Ezra, it's a different story. Notice how what's in bold here is not what's in common. This is the thing that I just want to highlight for you. So here, highlighting that King Darius of Persia made a decree, and they searched the archives where the documents are stored in Babylon and found the record that King Cyrus had issued a decree about the house of God in Jerusalem. It should be rebuilt, and the cost paid from the royal treasury, but it'll also be paid, as we can see, from the people in the land themselves. As you can see here, the cost to be paid to these people in full without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river, also known as Yehud. And then this he says that the offering may be pleasing sacrifice of the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king. So in the vision of Ezra, the new polity is a combined allegiance to their God Yahweh and to the Persian king. And as you can see that down here, they finished their building by command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia, and they offer sacrifice there. So all three of those are in mind, not necessarily at the same moment as 1 Kings, but in the minds of people trying to establish what kind of polity will there be. The story in 1 Kings 8, as most scholars note, is almost certainly a composite from different time periods, and yet it does form a structure with many, many repeated key words. And you can see if I zoom out all the color for all the key words. But the chiastic shape is clearly present. The beginning we see in the bold italic underlined here. They sacrificed so many sheep and oxen they could not be counted or numbered. And we see at the other end, offering a sacrifice of well-being, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So they can be counted. But that frames the whole chapter. And we'll see how it brings together. You can see here, I'll zoom in a little if it's small on your screen, the Davidic covenant with also the Mosaic covenant. So plainly, that's after the time of Exodus being written, to know about Moses, who we hadn't heard mentioned at all in the David story, nor earlier in the Solomon story. So trying to bring together the two traditions, along with Deuteronomy, probably for an exilic audience, establishing a post-monarchical polity. Because very little in this speech is about monarchy or about the temple. It's mostly about prayer and confession and following the rules of Torah according to Deuteronomy. So we'll be looking at that in more detail. One of the things also to notice before we actually enter the story is all the various names of the people who are gathered in by Solomon in 1 Kings. And that highlights something that many scholars have dealt with, and again, it goes down a very deep rabbit hole. Since Solomon is king in Judah, in Jerusalem, Judah is never mentioned, and we see how many different ways Israel is mentioned. In the very first line, as you can see on the left side of the screen, the elders of Israel, and then we see the men of Israel, the congregation of Israel, my, your, or his people Israel so many times, the assembly of Israel, the tribes of Israel, and all Israel and the sons of Israel. But these are not necessarily the Israelites in Jerusalem, they're the Judahites. And we know that because as soon as it's over, Jeroboam gathers all Israel, and they say to Solomon's son Rehoboam, what do we have to do to you, with you, to your tents, O Israel? We have nothing to do with the son of Jesse. So in other words, what we see is that Israel was only part of this empire of Solomon because David had convinced the Israelites that he would destroy them after Saul was dead. And so in an emergency expedient, they said, we're your bone and flesh and we'll join with you. But the historical reality is almost certainly that Israel and Judah were two completely separate places, although they seem to have worshipped the one God Yahweh and spoken the same language, Hebrew, and yet were very different polities, and we'll see more of that as we go. So what's with Solomon claiming everything about Israel and nothing about Judah? And I can only point that out now, but we'll have to look at that more in detail as we go. Notice also the heads of the tribes are named here, but only the once, and priests are mentioned once, and Levites mentioned only once, so other possibilities in there, but not featured. Before we conclude, just want to note in the other chapters we're going to look at, chapter 9 and 10, which again are composite, but they have some very interesting elements. And I put the Hiram elements in yellow here to see how they're placed in various places in between here, whether that's between the question of the Queen of Sheba that we see here, or the summary of his wealth. And notice how many times you hear about gold, 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 gold throughout the whole thing. And again, one has to ask, is that meant to praise Solomon or to show him simply as greedy and gold-oriented and not oriented around the justice and peace, which we're told in one of the prayers is the point of why he's king? And so that sets up our story. We'll begin to look in some detail that we did in the last couple chapters in the next video as we see how the narrator here from whatever time period sets up the beginning of Solomon's speech. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.